Chapter 33 talks about two of the biggest events in world history, World War I and the Russian Revolution. This video will discuss the background of World War I as well as the war itself. By 1914, Europe had separated into two opposing sides. The Central Powers consisted of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, as well as the Ottoman Empire, which was loosely allied with Germany. The other alliance was the Triple Entente, composed of Britain, France, and Russia. One of the biggest reasons for the start of World War I was the nationalist aspirations of many European countries and ethnic groups. Nationalism, for an existing country, is the strong belief that its interests are of primary importance. For a group of people who share a common language, history, and culture, but are not an independent country, it is the belief that they should constitute an independent nation free of foreign domination. This idea gained popularity during the French Revolution and spread as far away as Latin America. The idea of self-determination suggested that each ethnic group had the right to a sovereign or independent state. Although popular in multicultural empires like Austria, Russia, and the Ottomans, it was opposed by those rulers who oppressed it to keep their empires intact. This led to considerable nationalistic tensions in each of those empires, with ethnic enclaves looking for outright independence. A large ethnic group that stretched from the Ottoman Empire in the south to Austria in the west to Russia in the east were the Slavic peoples. Slavic nationalism stressed a brotherhood amongst all Slavic peoples and a strong desire to free any who were under the yoke of non-Slavic rulers. After Greek independence in 1829, Slavs in the Balkans slipped out of Ottoman control. Austria-Hungary, however, continued to have a tight grip on the Slavic Serbs in Bosnia in the early 1900s. Russians encouraged those Serbs seeking to break free of Austrian rule by promoting pan-Slavism, the idea that Slavs throughout Europe should be united. This radicalized Serb nationalists in the Austrian Empire already looking to unify with the independent country of Serbia. As Russia encouraged the nationalism that was attempting to break apart the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Germany backed the Austrians' desire to fight it. This gave Austria the confidence to fight against the radical Serbs, knowing that any attempt by Russia to intervene would bring the Germans to their rescue. This type of intense nationalism spread well beyond the Slavic populations of Eastern Europe. For the established nation-states of Western Europe in the late 19th century, this led to fierce rivalries that ultimately helped to cause World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II's desire for his German Empire to have a place in the sun led to a massive buildup of his naval power. This dramatically increased tensions between Germany and Britain, who saw Germany's naval buildup as a direct threat towards its world empire. Germany's rapid industrial growth had already begun to threaten British economic predominance. Britain was not about to let its naval superiority be surpassed by the Germans. Both states built huge iron battleships called dreadnoughts in an attempt to gain a naval advantage over the other. With a newly built navy, the colonial disputes between Germany and Britain and France broke out in Africa and Asia in the late 19th century. As one of the newest countries in Europe, Germany naturally came late to the colonial race in Africa and Asia. Germany resented the fact that Britain and France had already claimed so much of the unindustrialized world and began to challenge them for control of those regions. In 1905, Germany and France almost went to war over Morocco's attempt at independence. Although war was avoided through an international conference, France and Britain were now firmly allied against German interests. The Balkan Wars of 1912 further strained diplomatic relations between the great powers of Europe. Public opinion supported these types of national rivalries. A nationalistic mass media throughout Europe led to attitudes of aggressive patriotism amongst its citizens. As a result, European leaders were under increasing pressure to take antagonistic stances in foreign policy decisions. As countries became more belligerent towards each other, they began to look for allies that would come to their aid if war did break out. A rival system of alliances developed and divided Europe into two different camps. In each alliance system, allies were obligated to come to one another's defense. The Central Powers were one of those alliance systems. Germany and Austria-Hungary formed a dual alliance in 1879. Fearful of French aggression, Italy joined Germany and Austria in 1882, forming the Triple Alliance. The Ottoman Empire, loosely affiliated with Germany in the late 1800s, gravitated towards the Central Powers camp by the outbreak of World War I. The other European alliance system was known simply as the Allies. Britain, France, and Russia were also known as the Triple Entente. A shifting series of treaties ended in a military pact between the three in 1914. With alliances set, each country began to prepare for war. Military leaders from both sides devised inflexible and what were eventually unsuccessful military plans and timetables. France's Plan 17 focused on offensive maneuvers and attacks. Germany's Schleifenplan depended on swiftly attacking and defeating France, and then turning to defend against a slower Russian military. What started as a localized Balkan crisis in the summer of 1914 quickly escalated into the largest global conflict mankind had ever seen. On June 28, 1914, a Serbian nationalist of the Austro-Hungarian Empire named Galvo Princip assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his lovely wife Sophie. Austria, believing that the tiny country of Serbia was behind the Archduke's assassination, declared war 1 month later, on July 28th. Russia mobilized its troops to defend its Serbian ally against what it saw as unjust Austrian aggression. Hoping to keep the Austro-Serb conflict localized, Germany sent ultimatums to Russia and France demanding they stay out of the skirmish. The ultimatums were ignored, and as a result, Germany declared war on Russia and France. Sticking to its Schleifenplan, Germany invaded Belgium and quickly attacked France. On August 4th, in an effort to protect Belgium's neutrality, Britain declared war on Germany. Within 1 month of Franz Ferdinand's assassination, all of Europe was plunged into a great war. With the exception of World War II, World War I was the most violent and destructive conflict in human history. For a war that would become costly and gruesome beyond imagination, morale started off quite high. It was greeted with enthusiasm by citizens of the Central Powers as well as the Allies. People expected the war to be brief, and their side, of course, to be victorious. The war on the Western Front was anything but quick. The German invasion of France was stopped at the River Marne. A stalemate ensued for the next 3 years, with neither side gaining any significant ground. Defensive trenches ran from the English Channel to Switzerland. Soldiers effectively dug in and were able to turn back just about any enemy attack. Italy, who never actually had a military pact with Austria and Germany, stayed neutral at first. The Triple Alliance was a defensive pact, and since Germany and Austria were seen as starting the war, Italy refused to come to their aid. A year later, Italy switched its position again, joining the side of the Allies in exchange for the promise of Austrian land on the east coast of the Adriatic Sea. The Italians opened a southern front for the Allies and maintained a defensive line against Austria-Hungary. The war on the Western Front dragged on in a bloody stalemate. New technologies favored defensive tactics over offensive ones. Advancing soldiers were sitting ducks for the defenders burrowed in trenches with machine guns. Poison gas was one of the deadliest defensive weapons of the Great War. Introduced by the Germans, both sides were using it by 1915. Mustard gas, the most widely used poisonous gas of the war, caused 800,000 casualties on both sides. One of those unfortunate casualties was a young man from Massachusetts named Edgar Sykes. While defending an Allied trench in France, he found time to write a letter to one of his relatives back home. Dear Granddad, I wish to write to apologize for not writing sooner. I'm going to blame nothing, as it is all my own fault. We are not allowed to say much about our operations, so this letter may seem to you to be very short. We are now living about 5 miles from the first-line trenches, and it is a very common thing to see airplane fights when the weather is good. I have myself been in the trenches twice for short stays. They were interesting in ways. All of a sudden, I could hear the boom of a gun in the distance, and then there would be the whistling of the shell going around me, and then the explosion of the shell about 300 or 400 feet on either side of me. Then, if I did not keep low, so as not to be seen, I would all of a sudden hear the whistling of machine gun bullets striking the bank in the back of me. There's one thing about this country, it does not produce enough American cigarettes or candy. You people cannot imagine how hungry we get for chocolates or some kind of candy. We have the YMCA in about every camp, and we strike once in a while, and we do get a stock of American chocolate in, but it doesn't last very long. I can't think of anything else to write at present time, so I will close in hoping to hear from you soon. Private Edgar W. Sykes. 6 weeks later, Edgar's father receives a telegraph from the front saying that he was wounded, but it was nothing serious. 2 weeks after that, a letter is sent to the Sykes family informing them of their son's death from mustard gas. A letter from the Red Cross explains his last days in detail, painting a picture of a brave hero who remained strong in the face of mortal injuries. American families would receive over 100,000 more of these condolence letters before the war was over. New weapons were invented as the war progressed in an attempt to break the stalemate in the West. Armored tanks were used to break down trenches towards the end of the war. Without bombing payloads, airplanes were mainly used for reconnaissance. When machine guns were added later, airplanes became better known for dogfighting. Because of the superiority of Britain's navy, the Germans turned to submarine warfare to even the playing field. While the British choked off supplies to Germans with a naval blockade, German submarines torpedoed ships trying to supply the Allied war effort. The most horrific scenes of World War I could be found in No Man's Land, an area between the trenches where most of the fighting took place. It was littered with dead soldiers that failed to breach the enemy's trench. These pictures serve as a grim reminder of the deadliness of trench warfare. The Eastern Front was not as stagnant as the Western Front. Battle lines were much more fluid in the Balkans and Russia. German forces may have met their match with British and French forces in France, but the Austrian-German forces were far superior to the militaries of Serbia, Albania, and Romania. Russia's quicker than expected mobilization allowed them to invade Prussia, the northeastern part of Germany, but German forces quickly drove them out and deep into Russian territory. The Russians attempted to counterattack, but they were less equipped and poorly led. Those attacks collapsed in a sea of casualties. Meanwhile, back on the Western Front, the battles were long and costly for both sides. Verdun may have been considered a victory for the French, but it left over 300,000 Frenchmen dead on the battlefield, while the Germans lost 280,000 men. In the Somme offensive, British forces gained 6 miles at the cost of 420,000 of their men, along with the deaths of 420,000 Germans. It was not only soldiers who paid the ultimate price during World War I, civilians also became targets of enemy military operations. Air raids bombed civilian targets. Naval blockades not only starved militaries of needed supplies, but starved civilians of essentials needed for survival. World War I was the first total war in which both military personnel and civilians participated in its outcome. The home front was where civilians marshaled economics and industry for the war effort. The economies of each country were mobilized towards the war effort. Governments militarized civilian war production. They imposed wage and price controls, ensuring the low-cost production of military supplies. Conscription was seen in all countries fighting the war. Germany even extended the military draft for all men ages 16 to 60. Women served the war by entering the workforce. They took over the jobs that the men sent off to fight previously had. These jobs could sometimes be quite hazardous. Women worked in factories making explosives, artillery shells, and TNT. Though dangerous, it was a liberating experience for women, especially in the upper and middle classes of society. It gave them a real sense of equality. Shortly after the war, many Western nations granted suffrage to women or the right to vote. Propaganda, or biased information used to promote a cause, was used quite effectively during the Great War. Propaganda campaigns were used to maintain national support for the war. Posters, songs, and newspaper reports were all skewed to keep up public morale and to encourage more people to join the war effort. Anti-war sentiment was not tolerated. Censorship and restrictions on civil liberties were common. Propaganda was also designed to dehumanize the enemy. Civilians came to see the enemy as pure evil. World War I was fought on more than just the European continent. It was truly a global conflict. European powers dominated most parts of the world by 1914, and war quickly spilled over to their colonies. British and French forces recruited colonial natives to fight against the Germans. Eventually, non-European powers like the United States and the Ottoman Empire joined the fight. Japan entered the war on the side of the Allies and seized German-held territory in China. New Zealand and Australia also joined and took German-held lands in the Pacific. The 21 Demands were an attempt to advance Japan's imperial interests in China. Japan used World War I as an excuse to take over large amounts of land and raw materials in China. The 21 Demands were designed to reduce it to a Japanese protectorate, in effect a colony whose only purpose was to have resources extracted from it. Britain intervened, however, and was able to stop the total domination of China by the Japanese. War ravaged not only in Europe and China, but in the Middle East and Africa as well. Allies targeted the four main German colonies in Africa. Togoland fell quickly, while Cameroon, East Africa, and Southwest Africa did not. Many Allied soldiers and workers died from the tropical diseases in the African theater. One of the biggest battles of World War I was fought near the Middle East on the peninsula of Gallipoli. Located in Ottoman Turkey, Gallipoli was on a key waterway, the Dardanelles Strait. The British plan was to strike at the weakest of the Central Powers, the Ottoman Empire, in an attempt to remove them from the war. The campaign did not prove that easy, however. The Battle of Gallipoli turned out to be a disaster for the British, who sustained 250,000 casualties. It also weakened the ties of Britain's closest allies, the Canadians, Australians, and New Zealanders. The Ottomans did not fare any better after Gallipoli. It was the beginning of a series of major losses suffered by the Turks. The Russians took the Caucasus Mountains. The Arabs revolted with significant aid from the British. One of the more famous figures of World War I was a British officer who helped to organize Arab resistance against the Ottoman Turks. His name was Thomas Edward Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia.